G'day, mate. This is the Do and Teach Guy podcast. Quick disclaimer, everything I say is my opinion or interpretation only and is based on my logic, research and convictions. All scriptures are read from the New King James Version. So veg out and let's give it a bash. This is episode 12, and today we're talking about Noah and the flood, a well-known and beloved story that everyone thinks they know, but some people really only know a watered-down Sunday school version. Watered down? See what I did there? Anyway, let's get into it. Perfect Noah? So to start off, we see an old man that's at least 500 years old named Noah, who was perfect. Genesis 6 verse 9 says, "This is the genealogy of Noah. Noah was a just man, perfect in his generations. Noah walked with God." No, Noah wasn't perfect, as in sinless anyway, but he did follow God's commands. I suspect that this perfect attribute was credited to him, his wife, his kids, and their wives, because they didn't have any corrupted fallen angel DNA in them. They were perfect, 100% humans. Which leads me to believe that a large portion of the rest of the planet had corrupted DNA, with corrupted heart attitudes towards God to go with it, and they needed to be wiped out. Giant. In case you're not aware, before the flood, a whole bunch of demons had children with many human women. How many is unknown, and for how long or how many generations it went on for is also unknown. But it seems that it went on for long enough that a large portion of the population was affected. Genesis 6 verse 4. There were giants on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came in to the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. Those were the mighty men, who were of old, men of renown. These children were so mighty because they had demon DNA in them. You may be aware that human DNA is made up of two strands twisting around each other. It's called a double helix. Theoretically, with the addition of demon DNA, the human DNA would have turned into a triple helix, causing the people to grow much larger as one of many potential super attributes. But these people tended to act like their demon ancestors, ignoring God's ways, fixated on hate and selfishness. There's also a bit tacked on to the end of a sentence here, saying that there will be giants on the earth after the flood as well. This is a bit of a rabbit hole that I won't be covering in this episode, so we'll ignore that bit for now. It's said by some, based on some non-biblical texts, that the giants were anywhere from 9 to 40 feet high. That's around 3 to 13 meters. I think a little exaggeration has been added in there, but I would more reasonably say 3 to 5 meters is more likely. Anyway, these giants were not the lanky and scrawny kind, like we see today with the people who have the disease of gigantism. But the demon spawn giants were unnaturally wide and buffed. Some say they even had booming voices, red glowing eyes, and red or blonde hair. Also, the women who were to give birth to them would not have been able to do so naturally. It's thought that these women were killed as a sacrifice and the kids cut out. The first fatal C-sections. Anyway, you can research stuff about giants yourself if you like. None of it's hard to find since it's part of every culture's history and present-day myths throughout the world. Flood objections. A lot of people who don't believe in this story have a bunch of issues they like to bring up to support their lack of belief. However, most of the problems they come up with can be solved through simple logic to get at least possible answers. Since the text is not detailed enough to answer these questions with scripture, possible answers are about our only option. Objection 1. How could Noah build a ship that big by himself? Well, God told Noah to make the ship, but he didn't say he had to do it alone. He had his wife, his kids, and their wives to help. But we also don't know how rich Noah was. He could have easily paid hundreds of contractors to help him build it for all we know. Side note, Noah was probably the high priest at the time, since he was to be among the few survivors. If not, he certainly would have become the new high priest after the flood, so he at least wouldn't have been strapped for cash. Anyway, it's safe to assume that God would have blessed Noah with everything he needed to make the ship, including the knowledge, skill, resources, and labor needed to finish the project on time. It doesn't mention how long before the flood Noah was told about the ship either. All we get is at 500 years old, he had his kids, as referenced in Genesis 5 verse 32. And Noah was 500 years old, and Noah begot Shem, Ham, and Japheth. This verse could be a summary and saying Noah was told about the ark at 500 and he already had 3 grown-up kids. But we'll ignore that and take off at least 20 years for his kids to grow up and get married. As it says in Genesis 6 verse 18, just after God said to build it. But I will establish my covenant with you, and you shall go into the ark, you, your sons, your wife, and your sons' wives with you. It also says in Genesis 7 verse 6, Noah was 600 years old when the flood waters were on the earth. So if Noah's kids all got married in their 20s, they would have had 80 years to build the ship. That seems like a reasonable time for 8 people to build a big boat. Even though I'm sure that Noah would have been allowed to employ contractors to do some work. But we could squeeze a bunch more time if we consider that Genesis 6 verse 18 could have been a prophecy. This could have been said even before his kids were born. Anyway, back to the about 80-year hypothesis. Against popular belief, Noah and people in general would have been much smarter than we are today. They hadn't had the 4,500 years of DNA degradation and loss like us. I would estimate their IQs, if you take any stock in that flawed intelligent measuring system, were at somewhere over 500 or 600. In other words, many times smarter than us. We also have no idea of their technology level either. Considering now, in this day and age of computers doing everything for us, we still probably couldn't make the pyramids as good as the people did back then. We don't even know how they did it. We are definitely not more advanced than they were then. Also, like when the tabernacle was built, God had shown that he was able to gift the knowledge and skill to people to get jobs done, like in Exodus 31 verses 2 and 3. See, I have called by name Bezalel, the son of Uri, the son of of the tribe of Judah, and I have filled him with the Spirit of God, in wisdom, in understanding, in knowledge, and in all manner of workmanship. If Noah and his family worked on the ship by themselves, 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, for 80 years, they would have had about 2.4 million hours to build it. I don't know much about shipbuilding, but that seems plenty of time to me. As a comparison, the Ark Encounter in America, a life-sized replica, took about 2 years to build, and that's with stricter labour laws and unions probably slowing everything down. What about materials? As long as Noah lived near a forest, there would have been plenty of fat trees to use. Maybe since some of the animals were really big, then maybe the trees might have been really big too. So time, wood, and ability were not an issue. Objection 2. How could all the animals fit on such a small ship? Well, it wasn't that small. There was almost a hectare of floor space, or 2.5 acres, like 100,000 square feet, or just under 10,000 square meters. Pick your own measurement. According to the Ark Encounter and answers in Genesis, there were about 1,400 kinds of animals, totaling less than 7,000 actual animals. Also, they say that the average size of the animals was about the same size as a sheep. Keep in mind that there wasn't just 2 of every animal. There were 2 of every unclean animal and 7 of every clean animal. So, worst case, there would be, by my calculations, more space per animal than a factory farm allocates in today's cruel farming system. Also, since all the animals were tame and ate the same food, there would be no need to separate the pens. All those wood dividers would have taken unnecessary room and time to build. Also, that's assuming that all the animals were fully grown, which they wouldn't have been. They all probably would have been around the age where they stopped weaning. So they would have plenty of time to repopulate the planet before they died. So you could probably halve the average size of those animals. But if they went on as kids, wouldn't they have gotten bigger after a year? This is answered in the next objection. Objection 3. How did they fit enough food for the animals? And where would all their droppings go? This is easily enough explained with logic. If God had the ability to bring specific amounts of each species type to a specific place at a specific time, it's not too hard to believe that God could make all of those same animals hibernate for a year. That way, they would only need enough food for when they started waking up. And we know he can force people to go to sleep, like when Adam was put to sleep before Eve was ripped out. This theory also eliminates the droppings issue, and the issue of how did only 8 people look after so many animals. But keep in mind there was a window in the ark that stuff could have been thrown out, so they didn't have to store all the waste. Also, while animals are hibernating, they don't grow, solving the space getting less as time went on. This hibernating theory also solves the issue of some of the animals who only live for less than a year. If, however, 8 people did have to look after fully grown and awake animals, they would have had about 60 seconds with each, which is more than sufficient to scoop up yesterday's food and add today's food. Objection 4. How did all the plants and trees survive underwater for a year? First of all, they weren't all underwater for a full year. There was a month at the start that the mountains would not have been underwater. Then at the end, as the water slowly lowered, bits of land would have emerged a month or two earlier as well. Second, some seeds would have been floating and been sitting on floating trees and debris. Third, just like humans, the DNA of the plants might have been better, so they could have handled the soaking for yonks. Fourth, who says God didn't just supernaturally cause everything to grow like he did at the creation? Fifth, Noah could have hoarded seeds in the ark to replant them afterwards. This is probably where he got the stuff to plant his vineyard from. Sixth, the water wasn't salt water and probably had a lot of dirt particles in it, so the plants that were floating in the water could have got nutrients from the dirt, and they would have grown nice long roots while they floated around waiting for the water to recede. Maybe a bunch of plants and trees didn't survive. Maybe there could have been several times more varieties before the flood. Not to mention that the plants and trees have family groups like the animals do. The one type of tree could have changed over the years into many different types of trees in the same family group. The possibilities are endless, so who's to say a little of each of these options didn't happen? This brings me to the question of what did the animals eat when they got off the ark? And the obvious answer is grass. Grass is hearty stuff. It only takes a couple of days to grow, and there wasn't that many animals that needed feeding. Over several years, as their populations grew, so would have all the trees and stuff. Objections 5 to 7. The next three kind of all go together, so I'll treat them as one. Objection 5 is, how did a bunch of the animals get to the other side of the planet? Obviously, they walked, or flew if they were birds. Who cares if it took dozens of years to walk all the way to Australia, since it would have taken the humans much longer to settle out that far. What's that? Animals can't walk on water? You're right. This is where the Ice Age theory comes in. And to clarify, when I say Ice Age, I don't mean that the whole world was frozen. It just means that there was more ice than normal for a few years. This ties in with Objection 6, which is where did all the water come from and go? Genesis 8 verses 1 and 2. Then God remembered Noah, and every living thing, and all the animals that were with him in the ark. And God made a wind to pass over the earth, and the waters subsided. The fountains of the deep and the windows of heaven were also stopped, and the rain from heaven was restrained. So this wind that passed over the earth would probably have been blowing in mostly the north and south poles. This would cause the temperature to drop and ice to form. There would have been a point where there was much more ice around than there is now. This would have reduced the water's depth and made land and ice bridges to all parts of the planet. Then there's the fountain of the deep stopping. This is water that came up from underground. Only recently has science discovered a bunch of underground oceans. This is probably where a lot of the water drained into. Also, before the flood, there would have been less mountains, and mountains that were not as high. So the water probably didn't get as high as you think it did. All the Bible says is that the water got 15 cubits above the highest point. So, as the water drained into the earth, it may have messed with the tectonic plates and caused mountains to rise up to make room for the water. It also says that the windows of heaven were stopped and the rain was restrained. This could mean that a bunch of the water evaporated into the sky and God stopped it raining back down for a while. This would have made a lot more clouds and lowered the surface temperature to cause more ice, and also reducing the water level to make more land and ice bridges. Then, after a few years, when all the animals, probably by God's guidance, made it to their destined places, the cold winds would have stopped and the rain would have come down again. This would have melted a bunch of the ice and caused the oceans to rise to their current levels. Objection 7 is, if all the animals were in one place, why don't we see fossils of kangaroos in Europe? Fossils only form during cataclysmic events. The Earth would have been pretty peaceful for a few years while the animals were travelling, so no fossils would have been formed. Different types of animals heading off to different countries would have stayed in their herds and family groups. And since they were all pretty young to start with, and it's possible that not even one of them died while travelling, since most animals live at least 10 years, they would have had plenty of time to get to their new homes. It also probably didn't take as long as you think for them to migrate. Now back to Objection 5 of the animals walking around the world. The herds could have walked halfway around the world in less than 1 year. To do the maths, the Earth has a circumference of about 40,000 kilometres, or 25,000 miles. This needs to be halved to reach the opposite side. So, for an animal to walk 12 hours a day at normal walking speed of 5 kilometres an hour, or about 3 miles an hour, they would go about 60 kilometres a day. Times that by 360 days, which was the amount of days in the year at the time, and you get well past the opposite side of the planet. Obviously, it took a little longer because they didn't walk in a straight line, but you get the point. As you may have noticed, my theory of these events at no time has a Pangea-style supercontinent. I don't think that was ever a thing. Yes, we're told that with satellite images, they can see the land masses moving about an inch or a couple of centimetres every year, if that's true. But over the course of 4,500 years, that's only about 120 kilometres or 70 miles. Not enough to make an impact. Land bridges and ice bridges are a much more logical explanation for animals to get around. Plus, the continents look like they could fit together in the same way that rivers look like they could fit together if the land closed up. If the slope of the land under the water is about the same everywhere, the opposite side of land would look the same. Not that hard to figure out. Objection 8 and 9. Where did all the rain come from? And, which doesn't seem related, but it is, where did all the dinosaurs go then? The answer to these two objections was covered in the first episode on the Book of Job. But to sum up, the rain could have come from the melting ice sky dome, and the dinosaurs got too big and died from lack of air due to the lower pressure atmosphere, or killed as trophies by the people who mismanaged the Earth. Supposed contradiction. That's enough of the objections. Now we'll move on to an alleged contradiction, where one verse says 2 of every animal and another verse says 7 of some. They can't both be right. This is like the easiest one to solve. Genesis 6 verses 19 and 20 say, "And of every living thing of all flesh you shall bring 2 of every sort into the ark, to keep them alive with you. They shall be male and female, of the birds after their kind, of animals after their kind, and of every creeping thing on the earth after its kind. 2 of every kind will come to you to keep them alive." First of all, this is a summary of what was said, so it's not trying to be accurate with their numbers. Second, if you just add in "at least" before the 2, it all makes sense. Shall bring at least 2 of every sort into the ark. It could also mean that they came by twos, one male and one female of each couple, so it doesn't exclude multiple sets of each couple. Then Genesis 7 verse 2 and 3 fits. You shall take with you 7 of each of every clean animal, a male and his female, 2 each of animals that are unclean, a male and his female, also 7 each of birds of the air, male and female, to keep the species alive on the face of all the earth. This section is a detailed account, and not an overview like before. Side note, here is one of the things that mainstream Christianity ignores. There are a bunch of instances before the law was given at Mount Sinai, like Noah knowing what clean and unclean animals there were, that show that God's law is eternal and not just for a certain group of people for a short time. But as you probably guessed, that's a topic for another episode. Anyway, contradiction solved. People are just looking for excuses to try and convince themselves that this story isn't true, because if it did turn out to be true, then there is a real God, and the people will have to face the fact that their sins will be held accountable to them on Judgment Day, which means if they want to have eternal life after death, they will have to give up their sinful lifestyle which they don't want to do. Why 7 clean animals? A few last things I want to cover before the end. One is the question of why were there 7 of each of the clean animals? Well, this is because later on, when they all got off the ship, Noah sacrificed 1 of every clean animal as an offering to God. So there still would have been 3 pairs of each of the clean animals still around. And later on, Noah is told that people can now eat clean animals from then on, so there needed to be more of them to keep up their numbers so they don't go extinct. Tame to wild. Last of all, the verse where animals became afraid of us. Genesis 9 verse 2. And the fear of you and the dread of you shall be on every beast of the earth, on every bird of the air, and all that move on the earth, and on all the fish of the sea. They are given into your hand. It's hard to imagine a world where all the animals were like the pets we have today, and I feel a little bad for Noah and his family, knowing how good it was to live in harmony with all of God's creatures, then having them all run away from him in fear. Effectively, they would have lost their 7,000 odd pets in a single day. The story continues. We are out of time for today, but this is not the end of the story. There is a bunch more stuff that happens, like the introduction of eating meat, the death penalty, the rainbow, the drunken scandal of Noah's family, and a bunch more. But these topics will have to wait for another episode. That's it for today. Thanks for listening. I pray that your faith grows, but more importantly, that it's shown through your life and your actions. Catch ya.